The lion was not sleeping. Samuel had known the difference for long enough that it lived somewhere beneath thought, in the part of him that had been shaped by 11 years of mornings in the Masai Mara mornings that began before the light and ended after it, mornings that had slowly, quietly, replaced whatever instincts he had arrived with and given him new ones in their place. A sleeping lion carries a particular quality of surrender. It folds into the earth as though the earth has asked for it back, temporarily. The breathing is long and unhurried. The body is loose at every joint. A sleeping lion belongs to the landscape so completely that the untrained eye passes over it without catching, the way the eye passes over a stone or a root or any other thing that has fully earned its place in a scene. This lion did not belong. He was lying on his side at the far southern edge of the Oleri waterhole, positioned in the thin, broken shade of an acacia grove, where the ground was pale and cracked, and the grass had been grazed to almost nothing. His body was oriented away from the water, toward the open plain, the direction a lion moves toward when the waterhole has given it what it came for. But this lion had not moved. His chest was rising and falling, which was the first and most important thing Samuel checked for when his binoculars found the shape and held it. But the rise and fall was wrong, too shallow, too careful, the breathing of a body managing something, rather than the breathing of a body at rest. Samuel had stopped his land cruiser on the elevated bank above the waterhole, where the track bent eastward through a stand of whistling thorn. He had cut the engine without making a decision to do so. The decision had been made somewhere below the level of language, by the part of him that read the land the way other men read pages, by pattern and rhythm, and the quiet vocabulary of things that are out of place. He lifted the binoculars again. The foreleg was the first clear sign. The lion's left front leg was drawn up and held against his body in a way that had no equivalent in rest or sleep. It was held the way an animal holds a wound, not folded, not tucked with the casual ease of a comfortable body, but pressed, and the pressing was deliberate, the whole barrel of the chest angled to protect and minimize and insulate that one specific point from any further contact with the world. The fur around the leg was matted and dark against the lighter coat of the upper body. From 40 meters, in the angled afternoon light, Samuel could see the swelling. He lowered the binoculars for a moment and looked at the waterhole with his bare eyes. On the opposite bank, a small group of zebra had settled into the shallow water, drinking with the distracted, flicking-eared vigilance that zebra maintain at all times. They had registered the lion. The arc of their approach to the water had bent wide and deliberate around the southern end of the bank, but they were not moving away. They were nervous, but they were not running. And this, to Samuel, was its own kind of information. A healthy lion, even a resting one, broadcasts something that other animals receive before they fully understand it. A pressure, a readiness, a capacity that requires no demonstration. The zebra's willingness to remain meant that whatever the lion at the water's edge was carrying, it was not that. He raised the binoculars a third time. The lion's eyes were open. They were directed at the middle distance, not at Samuel, not at the zebra, not tracking the small yellow birds that moved through the acacia branches above his resting place. They were the eyes of an animal somewhere between alertness and absence, present enough to register but not quite engaged enough to respond. The ears, which on a healthy lion move with constant, independent sensitivity, reading the soundscape in real time, were nearly still. One was half flattened against the skull, the other pointed loosely forward, neither tracking nor fully withdrawn. A wire snare. The thought arrived without drama, the way certain recognitions arrive when you have seen something enough times. The pattern of the injury, the tight, circular damage concentrated above the paw, the swelling that rose from a single point and radiated upward, was unmistakable to someone who had spent years navigating the consequences of what poachers laid along game trails in the dark hours. The snare itself might already be gone, broken, or cut at some point during the hours or days of the lion's struggle against it. But the signature it left on living tissue was its own kind of evidence, legible and damning. Samuel set down the binoculars and reached for the radio on the seat beside him. His hand was steady. His voice, when he spoke, was low and even. The voice of someone who has learned that composure is not the absence of urgency but its most useful form. "I need Dr. Rhea at the southern waterhole. Full kit. Come as fast as the track allows." He set the radio down and looked back at the lion. The animal had not moved. The waterhole was quiet. The afternoon heat pressed everything flat and close to the earth, and somewhere in the acacia branches above the lion, a small bird landed and adjusted its feet and was still. Samuel did not start the engine. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, and his eyes on the shape in the broken shade, and he waited, which was the only thing available to him, and he did it with the same careful, unhurried attention he brought to everything the Mara asked of him. The call had been made. What it could not do was close the distance between Dr. Rhea's vehicle and the southern waterhole any faster than the track allowed, and the track through the lower corridor was not a forgiving one ruts from the long rains, shallow washouts where the soil had given way beneath seasonal drainage, a crossing at the dry riverbed that added time even in the best conditions. Samuel knew the route. He had driven it enough times to know that 40 minutes was an optimistic estimate, and that optimistic estimates were the kind that cost animals their lives when the margin was already as thin as this one appeared to be. He looked back at the lion. In the time since the radio call, no more than 4 or 5 minutes, something had shifted. The breathing, which had been shallow and uneven before, now carried a quality that Samuel could identify even from the elevated bank without the binoculars. Each exhale came with a faint, audible release, not quite a vocalization, not quite a groan, but somewhere in the register between them. The sound of a body that has been managing pain for long enough that management has become its entire occupation, and the effort of that management is beginning to show at the edges. Samuel opened the door of the Land Cruiser. He did not make a deliberate decision to do this, or rather he made the decision in the way that certain choices get made in the field, not through a process of weighing and concluding, but through a recognition that something was already true, that the moment had already determined what it required, and that the only remaining question was whether he would honor that or step back from it. He had spent 11 years building the judgment that told him when to honor it and when to step back. He trusted that judgment more than he trusted any written protocol, not because the protocol was wrong, but because the protocol had not seen this particular lion, on this particular afternoon, with this particular quality of labored breathing spreading out across the still air of the waterhole. He moved slowly. Everything in the bush rewards slowness, not the slowness of hesitation, but the slowness of intention, of a body that knows exactly where it is going and has chosen not to announce it. He left the door of the Land Cruiser open behind him, which meant no closing sound, no percussive crack of metal on metal that would carry across the flat ground and into the acacia shade where the lion lay. At 30 meters, the lion's ear moved. It was the left ear, the one that had been half flattened against the skull, and it swiveled with a precision that had nothing to do with the rest of the animal's condition. Whatever else the snare and the infection and the days of immobility had taken from this lion, the hearing remained, acute and intact, registering Samuel's footfall on the dry grass with an ease that reminded him, as it always did, that proximity to a wild predator was never truly negotiated on human terms. Samuel stopped. He lowered himself into a crouch, reducing his profile, taking the vertical threat out of his posture. He remained still for a long moment, letting the lion's system process his presence and arrive at whatever conclusion it was going to arrive at. The lion's head had not lifted. The eyes had not shifted toward him, but the ear remained forward, and the breathing had changed very slightly, a pause, a recalibration, and then a return to the same shallow rhythm, which Samuel read as an absence of full alarm rather than acceptance, and which was, for the moment, enough. He moved the last 10 meters in increments, stopping, waiting, moving again. By the time he settled onto the dry earth at what he judged to be the closest distance that the situation could reasonably bear, the lion's eyes had found him, yellow-brown and still, carrying the weight of an animal somewhere between endurance and surrender. They held him for a long moment without urgency, without the particular voltage that a healthy lion's gaze carries. They were the eyes of exhaustion, and in their exhaustion was the only kind of safety this situation was going to offer. Samuel sat down fully on the ground. He rested his hands on his knees, open and loose, and he did not look directly at the lion's face. A sustained, direct gaze is a challenge in the language of most predators, and he had not come here to challenge anything. He looked slightly to the side, into the middle distance, present and visible but not pressing. The wound from here was worse than the binoculars had suggested. The constriction damage began just above the paw and traveled upward for several centimeters, and where the skin had been worn entirely away by days of swelling and movement against the wire, the exposed tissue was dark and raised and carried a smell on the warm afternoon air that Samuel recognized with the part of him that had been educated by the field rather than by any classroom. The leg was swollen to a width that spoke of deep inflammation, of fluid and infection, working inward from the surface toward the structures beneath. It was the kind of wound that progressed on its own schedule, indifferent to waiting. He checked his watch once. Then he put the watch out of his mind. "Easy," he said, in a voice that was barely above the ambient sound of the afternoon. "I'm right here." The lion's ear tilted fractionally toward the sound, that same involuntary acknowledgement of a registered frequency, and then returned to its forward angle. The breathing continued its careful, effortful rhythm. The flies gathered at the wound margin, and the acacia shade moved slightly as the afternoon wind shifted and the waterhole held its surface flat and still under the declining sun. Samuel stayed where he was. He watched the breathing. He counted the seconds between each exhale, and he watched the quality of the chest movement, and he tracked the small signs that told him whether the animal was stabilizing or declining, and he sat on the dry earth of the southern Mara with his hands open on his knees, and he waited, which was what the lion needed from him, and which was, in that hour, the hardest and most important thing he had to give. Dr. Rhea's vehicle came over the low ridge to the southwest without urgency, rolling down the slope with the engine kept deliberately quiet, coasting the last stretch of ground on momentum alone. She had done this before arrived at a scene where the margin between an animal's cooperation and its complete withdrawal was measured in sound and speed and the particular quality of a human approach. She cut the engine entirely at 50 meters and let the vehicle settle to a stop in the dry grass, and the silence that followed was so complete that Samuel could hear the faint shift of the acacia branches in the low afternoon wind. She stepped out without speaking. Her team followed 2 field assistants who moved with the practiced economy of people who had learned that in situations like this, the body's unnecessary motions were a form of noise. The dart rifle was already assembled. The sedative had been drawn and measured during the drive, calculated on a weight estimate that Rhea had asked Samuel for over the radio, and which he had provided in the clipped, precise shorthand of someone who has learned to observe and report without editorializing. Samuel rose from the ground slowly as she reached him, unfolding from his long crouch with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who had been still for long enough that standing required negotiation. He stepped back without being asked, creating space, allowing the veterinarian's assessment to happen without the additional variable of his own proximity to the animal. Rhea looked at the lion for a long moment before she raised the rifle. The dart found him in the thick muscle of the haunch, a clean placement, the kind that comes from years of field work and the particular stillness that expertise produces at the moment of release. The lion startled, a brief and powerful surge that lasted less than 3 seconds. Legs pressing against the cracked earth, head lifting with something close to the authority his body had carried before the snare had taken so much of it, a low sound rising in the chest that was neither roar nor moan but something between the two. Then the sedative moved through him, and the effort released, and he settled back into the pale grass with a long, shuddering exhalation that seemed to carry the accumulated weight of several days along with it. The team moved in. They worked with the quietness of people who understood that even an unconscious wild animal exists in a state of vulnerability that deserves to be honored rather than simply managed. Equipment was set down without clattering. Voices, when necessary, were kept at the level of the ambient afternoon. Rhea knelt at the foreleg and began her assessment with her hands, not instruments first, but hands, reading the extent of the damage through touch before she reached for anything else. The wound was deep. The wire had been in place for at minimum 4 days, and the tissue damage extended further inward than the surface suggested. There was necrosis at the wound margin early stage, not yet irreversible, but positioned close enough to that border that the next 72 hours would determine the outcome more than anything the team did in the next hour. Rhea did not narrate this aloud. She communicated it through the slight change in her breathing, the additional care that entered her hands, the way she adjusted the angle of the irrigation without breaking the rhythm of the work. Samuel had moved to the lion's head. No one had asked him to. There was no clinical reason for his presence at that end of the animal. The work was concentrated at the foreleg, and a sedated lion's head requires no supervision. But he settled into a crouch beside the great mane and stayed there, one hand resting on the dry earth 2 inches from the lion's face, close enough to be a presence without being a pressure. The team moved around him without comment. Some things explained themselves. The lion's breathing was the measure of everything. In the first minutes after sedation, it was ragged and shallow, carrying the residue of distress. But as the cleaning progressed, as the irrigation washed the wound and the careful debridement removed what the infection had already claimed, as the antibiotic was administered in a long, slow injection and the field dressing was laid with the gentleness of someone handling something irreplaceable, the breathing changed. The intervals between exhales lengthened slightly. The chest movement, which had been tight and compensatory for days, began to soften. "He's steadying," Rhea said, almost to herself, not lifting her eyes from the wound. Samuel said nothing. He watched the rise and fall of the great chest in the shifting acacia shade, and the flies that had gathered at the wound margin were gone now, driven back by the antiseptic, and the afternoon air smelled of dry grass and clean gauze and the faint, warm musk of lion fur, and for a long while no one spoke, and the work continued, and the breathing held. The reversal agent worked the way it always did, not as a switch but as a tide, returning consciousness to the lion in gradual, incremental advances that had their own unhurried rhythm, indifferent to the 7 people standing in the acacia shade waiting for it. The ears came first. Even under sedation, they had never gone entirely still. There had been small, involuntary adjustments throughout the procedure, the body's oldest mechanisms persisting below the level of directed awareness, but now the movement changed in quality. The ears began tracking again, turning with purpose toward specific sounds, the faint percussion of a hoof on dry ground somewhere to the east, the brief call of a bird crossing the waterhole, the small sounds of the team members shifting their weight. Each sound was registered, assessed, filed. The body was beginning to read the world again, re-establishing the vast sensory map that a predator requires simply to exist. Samuel had not moved from the lion's head. The team had stepped back when Rhea gave the quiet signal that indicated the reversal agent had been administered. They had gathered near the vehicles at the respectful remove that protocol required, creating the space that the animal would need as awareness returned and the processing of its surroundings began. Samuel had risen with them, had taken several steps in that direction, and then had stopped. He was not certain, later, that he could have explained why. It was not a decision made against better judgment. It was something quieter than a decision, more like a recognition that where he was standing was where he was meant to be standing, and that moving away was the thing that would have required justification. Rhea had looked at him. She had not said anything. She had turned back to the lion. The eyes opened in stages. First a narrow line of yellow-brown, then wider, the pupils contracting as the light entered, the focus assembling itself from the inside out the way focus does when the mind is returning from somewhere far and dark. The lion blinked once, twice, and then held the eyes open, and the quality of the gaze shifted from the unfocused endurance of sedation into something that was present, aware, and engaged with the immediate world. The head lifted next, not with the effortful, labored movement of 2 hours ago, when raising it had been an act of will against significant resistance, but with a genuine engagement of the neck muscles, the chin coming up steadily until the animal was bearing his own weight on the front legs. He held that position for a long moment, orienting. The nostrils moved continuously, reading the accumulated information of the air around him, the antiseptic, the field dressing, the human scents, the waterhole, the dry grass, the distant animals. The ears tracked and tracked. Everything was being assessed simultaneously, processed through systems that had no equivalent in human neurology, generating a picture of the immediate environment that was complete and specific in ways that the people watching it could only approximate. The bandage on the foreleg was pale against the amber coat. The lion looked at it once, a brief, direct examination, and then his attention moved on. Whatever the dressing meant to him, it did not appear to mean threat. The team was completely still. Samuel stood 3 meters from the lion's head, in what had been, for the past hour, the space he had occupied beside the great mane. He was not crouching now. He was standing, with his arms at his sides and his hands open, and he was looking slightly away from the lion's face in the same careful, non-confrontational angle he had maintained since he first sat down on the dry earth of the waterhole bank. He was aware of his own breathing. He was aware of the distance. He was aware of the absolute, specific quality of the silence that had settled over the group. The lion turned his head. It was a slow movement, unhurried, with the full deliberateness of an animal in complete control of what its body was doing. Not a scan, not a general orientation toward a new sound or scent, a turn particular and directed, the yellow-brown gaze traveling from the open grass to the east, across the pale ground of the acacia shade, and settling on Samuel with the same quality of focused, specific attention that it had carried when it first found him across 40 meters of dry savanna bank. Samuel did not move. The lion held the gaze. 3 seconds. 4. Long enough for every person at the vehicles to understand, without any possibility of misreading, that what was happening was not incidental, not a random convergence of a recovering animal's unfocused attention, and a person who happened to be standing in its line of sight. The lion knew where Samuel was. The lion had always known where Samuel was. And now, in the strange quiet of the aftermath, with the pain lessened and the long isolation of the past several days resolved into this moment of open air and human presence and the clean smell of a dressed wound, the animal was choosing to communicate something that had no name in any language. He lowered his head. Slowly, with the full measured weight of it, the great head came down and rested briefly, completely, the massive jaw settling against Samuel's knee with a gentleness that was unmistakable and absolute. "Oh," someone at the vehicle said, barely a breath. 4 seconds, perhaps 5. The weight of the lion's head against his leg was real and warm and heavier than Samuel had expected, and he did not move, did not reach down, did not do anything that might disturb or abbreviate whatever this was. He simply received it, standing very still in the acacia shade with his hands open at his sides, while the savanna held its breath around him and the waterhole caught the declining light on its surface, and no one, in the entire length and breadth of that afternoon, said a single word. Then the lion raised his head, gathered himself, and rose. He stood on all 4 legs, and the world seemed to pause around that fact. The rise was not effortless. There was a careful sequence to it, a negotiation between the body's intention and its current capacity, the haunches gathering first, then the shoulders, the bandaged foreleg taking weight with a hesitation that lasted less than a second before it held. Dr. Rhea exhaled once, quietly, the sound of a held breath released not in relief but in the acknowledgement of something that had not been guaranteed and now was. The leg held, the lion stood, and the standing itself was its own kind of answer to the question that the past several hours had been quietly asking. He was not the animal he had been 4 days ago. Anyone watching could see that. The weight loss was visible in the slight hollowing along the flanks, the way the hip bones carried a definition they would not carry in full health. The shoulder compensation was present, a subtle redistribution of load that would likely remain for weeks as the foreleg healed. He stood with the particular quality of an animal that has been reduced by circumstance and knows, in the wordless way that wild things know their own condition, that the full restoration of what it was is still ahead of it, somewhere down the long corridor of days. But he stood, and after a moment, he took a step. Samuel watched from where he had remained, 3 meters away, his hands still loose at his sides. The rest of the team stayed at the vehicles. No one moved toward the lion. No one made any sound that might redirect or disturb the animal's own process of reorientation. This was the part of the work that required the most discipline, the stepping back, the deliberate withdrawal of human presence from an equation that had briefly and necessarily included it, the returning of the animal to its own authority. The temptation, in moments like this, was to remain close, to extend the connection, to be present for what came next. The practice was to let go. The lion walked toward the southern edge of the acacia grove. His gait carried the compensation, but also carried something beneath it, a quality that had nothing to do with injury and everything to do with what the animal was before the snare found him and what he would be again. It was in the angle of the head, slightly raised, reading the air. It was in the placement of each paw, deliberate and owned, on the dry, pale earth. It was in the way the long grass at the grove's edge parted around his chest as he reached it, not dramatically, not with any quality of ceremony, simply the way grass parts for a lion, because that is what grass does, because that relationship is older than observation and will outlast it. He did not look back. Samuel had not expected him to. Wild animals do not perform closure. They move forward because forward is where survival lives, and the past, the waterhole, the wire, the human hands, the strange suspended hours of sedation and care receded behind them the moment they entered the grass, absorbed into the continuous present tense that the savanna maintains without sentiment or exception. What had happened here today would leave no narrative trace in the lion. It would leave a scar on the foreleg, and a healed body, and perhaps some faint associative register in the deep memory that animals carry the smell of antiseptic, the particular warmth of a human presence that had asked nothing. But it would not be a story he carried. It would simply become part of what he was. That was as it should be. The sun was crossing toward the western tree line now, pulling the light down from overhead into the long, amber horizontality of late afternoon. The shadows of the acacias reached east across the pale ground in thin, branching lines, and the waterhole had gone the color of old bronze, and the air had lost the afternoon's hard heat and taken on the softer quality that precedes evening in the Mara cooler, slower, carrying the first suggestions of the sounds that belong to dusk. Samuel watched until the amber coat dissolved completely into the long grass, and the movement of the animal became indistinguishable from the movement of everything else. And then he watched the place where that dissolution had happened for a while longer, for no reason that he could have named, and for every reason that mattered. "Ready?" Rhea said, from somewhere behind him. He turned after a moment and walked back to the vehicle without answering. The engine started. The light moved. The waterhole held its surface still and quiet in the fading afternoon, and the grass where the lion had disappeared swayed once, gently, in a breath of wind, and then was still and gave nothing away, as the wild has always done, as it always will.